Hello, and welcome everyone to our event this month. It's great to see you all here. We've had record sign up for this event, which is really exciting. Many of you came along to the event we did late last year, I think, about Blake's notebook, the so-called Rossetti manuscript, where we did a deep dive into some of the questions around it and the contents and its own heritage and its legacy. And I'm really pleased that we've got a chance now to actually zoom in really quite specifically on one of the aspects of something that's written into that notebook. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Rebecca Marks, who is going to be talking about Blake's Last Judgement painting. I'm really pleased to have found Rebecca. I've been following her social media and the work she'd been doing around her PhD, which was on Blake's reception of Michelangelo. It's great to have an art historian involved, and all her social media is wonderful. If you if you're interested in art history and want those little snapshots and little insights, it's fantastic. So Rebecca, welcome. You're unmuted. That's fantastic. Rebecca, I just want to talk to you for a moment about your work and where you're coming from, because I found you on social media. Your social media is excellent and very broad, and perhaps I think what appealed to me was that I discovered Blake through the art, through the images, and the images are far more important to me personally than the poetry. And being a very broad church in the Blake Society, we accept everybody's interest in Blake and where they've come at it from. But particularly that art side, I'm really curious about your approach on social media and of course your newsletters and everything. So can you just tell us, but perhaps just tell everyone a little bit about the PhD that you've just completed, and sort of where your starting point in this was?
Yes. So hi everyone. Nice to be here, and I'm so excited to speak for the Blake Society. So I guess it all goes back really to when I went to interview for my undergraduate degree. It was when Michael Phillips's exhibition William Blake Apprentice and Master was on at the Ashmolean in 2014 or 2015. And that was really the first time I encountered Blake's works, and it was in a purely kind of art historical context. It was an exhibition at a museum. It was very focused around his large printed paintings of 1795. And I sort of had my mind set on I would love to write about this artist, in the future. And then I did a degree in English literature, and I never had any opportunity to write about Blake because there was no one working on Blake at my university. And in any case, I was more interested in his artwork. And then I went and did a master's and in art history because I've always been very interested in the arts. I did work briefly as a graphic designer. I know you're an illustrator, Tamsin, so I think Blake attracts a wide range of poets, artists. And so I did my master's, and then I decided to take it forward to a PhD. And my master's had been in Renaissance Italian art, and I had been focusing on the artist Michelangelo. And I think one of the things that attracted me to Michelangelo was the fact that his figures reminded me of Blake. These kind of musculous, globular, sinewy, powerful archetypal figures. I knew I had seen them before, and I was thinking of that exhibition I saw at the Ashmolean. And so I sort of became interested in the link between these two artists, and I found that Blake was actually very influenced by Michelangelo. And when I was looking for literature on this, I found that there was some, but there was no kind of authoritative study. And so that's what my PhD was all about. It was all about William Blake's reception of the Renaissance, and specifically Michelangelo, and why are his figures so kind of skinless and muscular and anatomical and Michelangelo-esque. So that was what my PhD was about. And one I mean, think about Michelangelo. One of the things you think about is the Last Judgement. And it is no coincidence that Blake himself did a number of Last Judgments. And, that's sort of what my talk today is all about. And you also mentioned my social media. So, I on social media, I am a sort of art historical generalist. I'm all about kind of bringing art history and a kind of basic understanding of the arts, like where we can see them, what are they about, what are the movements in art history, what's on at the moment in London. I just felt that there was a bit of a gap in the market for that on social media, and I really wanted to get a newsletter out every week, kind of just on the arts, because although I am a Blake specialist, I'm first and foremost someone who's interested in the arts and sort of getting people interested in them and helping access to learning about art history. So that's sort of what my newsletter is about, although I do often write about Blake. My last article was about Blake's exhibition.
I was going to say the one that's just arrived in my inbox is about Blake's 1809 exhibition, and is really interesting. So, can I hand over the floor to you for the presentation? There will be time for questions afterwards. So, at the bottom of your screens, everybody, there's a little button that says "Raise Hand." You can either just write your question into the chat, the conversation boxes, or put your hand up and I will try to get round to you. We've got quite a lot of people attending, so I will be asking everyone to keep their questions brief and get to the point, so we can include as many people as possible. So Rebecca, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you for an amazing introduction, and I look forward to speaking more later in the questions. So I am going to try and share my screen with you to get my PowerPoint set up. Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about William Blake's Last Judgment, and we'll go through the kind of complex history of Blake's relationship with the Last Judgment, but at the center of this talk today is a kind of empty void, and that is this lost history painting, this lost painting of the Last Judgment that Blake did, and that's what I'm interested in uncovering today. So, around 1815, William Blake, who was then nearing the winter of his life, began working on a gargantuan painting. Witness accounts report that it was about 7 feet tall and 5 feet wide. And according to Blake's friend and biographer, John Thomas Smith, that painting was an exquisitely finished design of the Last Judgment. It supposedly contained upwards of 1,000 figures. It would have had gold leaf details, and they were coloured with warm and cool pigments to resemble different metals. And Smith was awestruck by the gilded, reflected quality of the work. And with all this in mind, it is interesting that this painting doesn't survive. Blake never sold it, and at the time of his death in 1827, as his biographer Alexander Gilchrist records, nobody could be found to give 25 guineas for it. Although this apocryphal Last Judgment by Blake was supposedly monumental, imposing, and ambitious, it was also apparently terribly overworked. It was painted in a fast-drying medium of Blake's own making, a combination of gesso, whiting, and plaster. It was thickly applied, and it tended towards a sticky, dark finish, and might have looked something like the picture that you see on your screen now. This is an example of one of his so-called tempera paintings. So, when the two sons of Blake's friend George Cumberland saw the painting in 1815, they said that Blake had been labouring on it till it was nearly as black as your hat. Frederick Tatham, a patron of Blake's and an artist in his own right, who also saw the painting, said that it was very much spoiled and darkened by overwork. Tatham wondered whether it was an example of the creatively stifling forces, which Blake referred to as blotting and blurring demons. So, why am I so interested in this painting? What can we possibly learn about an artwork which exists only in the form of brief anecdotes? Well, surprisingly, rather a lot. Firstly, there's the allure of its lostness. And the last recorded instance of the whereabouts of Blake's Tempera of the Last Judgment was in his friend Frederick Tatham's house around 1846 to 47. While we don't know exactly what the painting might have looked like, there do exist many smaller, earlier designs of the same subject which Blake made between 1805 and 1809. You can see some examples of this on the screen now. These can be seen in various museums, including Petworth House in Sussex, Pollock House in Glasgow, the V&A in London, and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And you may have seen some of them. I've seen the Petworth House one. I have not yet seen the Glasgow one, although I would love to make a pilgrimage. So we also know that Blake conceptualized the Last Judgment as a narrative. This is because he wrote two beautiful descriptions of the Last Judgment in 1808 and 1810. And one of these comes in a letter which he wrote to Ozias Humphrey to accompany the Petworth house drawings. And the other comes in fragments in his notebook. And this is the one I'm most interested in today and how we're going to reconstruct that lost picture of the Last Judgment. And, it's through the remaining drawings and through the descriptions that we can, engage in this act of reconstruction. And we're able to amass a sort of interpretive picture of the Lost Judgment. And from that, perhaps garner some of the kind of spiritual experience which his friends described when they saw the painting. And so this brings me to my second point as to why Blake's Lost Judgment is so compelling. Because by reconstructing it, even just imaginatively, we can learn new things about Blake's artistic ambitions in the 1800s. We know, for example, that between 1809 and 1810, Blake staged his own solo exhibition in his family home in Broad Street, Soho. This no longer exists, it's now called Broadwick Street. But it's interesting that he took it upon himself to put on his own exhibition. Unfortunately, it was overall an abject failure. Blake didn't sell any pictures from the exhibition, and the famous review of it by Robert Hunt in the Examiner called Blake an unfortunate lunatic, a madman. So Blake had initially conceived of this solo exhibition as a way to get back at the Royal Academy, from whose summer exhibitions his paintings were regularly refused. He wanted to prove that his visionary, grand, and mythological artwork would be beneficial to the public in both aesthetic and moral ways. And although the exhibition had a poor reception, the catalogue that Blake wrote for it, which you can see the opening, the title page on the screen. The catalogue shows that Blake was ideologically committed to establishing himself as a monumental history painter. And before convinced of the failure of his first exhibition, Blake may even have been planning to hold a second one. And it is possible that the large-scale Tempera of the Last Judgment, which he painted around this time, would have fitted into that plan. So we generally think of Blake either as a poet or an engraver or a maker of illuminated books. We do not usually categorize him as a painter of histories. A painting like The Lost Last Judgment, vast, without poetry or text, and based entirely on medieval and Renaissance aesthetics, suggests an attempt by Blake to establish himself among the serious academic history painters of his day. Such a painting is in fact very Blakean, if not very poet-paintery. It aligns with what we know about Blake's lifelong desire to exhibit his works for the public. So Blake, along with his contemporaries James Barry and George Cumberland, describes his wish to paint huge monuments in Westminster, St. Paul's, and other civic spaces in London, kind of hoping to revive the grandeur, glory, and artistic idealism which he would have associated with Italian Renaissance painters like Michelangelo and Raphael. The purpose of this talk, then, is to use Blake's Lost Last Judgment to reframe him not just as a poet or eccentric visionary, but instead as a serious fine artist. I want to pose the following question. What if Blake's greatest work wasn't a poem or a series of poems or a prophecy or an illuminated book, but instead a large-scale painting that's lost to the annals of time? How would that change how we think about Blake as an artist? So Blake describes the Last Judgment in his notebook in the following terms. Thus, my picture is a history of art and science, which is humanity itself. Whenever any individual rejects error and embraces truth, a Last Judgment passes upon that individual. When Blake refers to art and science, he isn't talking about the practical disciplines which you might specialize in at school or at university. Instead, he's alluding to the contrary forces of the human soul, which he's always negotiating in his work. Art and science here also means imagination and reason, creation and destruction, vision and law, loss and unison, innocence and experience, and so on. But also, Blake doesn't just call his Last Judgment a picture of art and science, but a history of art and science. And this is very important, because the word history would have held some contextual implications for Blake. History painting is a specific genre of art. Histories are grand, mythological, narrative paintings. The word history comes from the Italian storia, which means eyewitness account. And the purpose of history paintings was primarily to illustrate a scene from religious or pagan legend with theatrical prowess and kind of moral power. Since the 16th century, histories had been considered the highest and grandest form of art. And Blake would have associated the genre with the painters of the Italian Renaissance and the French Academy and any kind of civically sponsored art, public art. In Blake's time, history painting was practiced by several 18th century English painters. In particular, Blake respected James Barry and John Hamilton Mortimer, both of whom were tenured Royal Academicians, although Barry was famously difficult and was booted out in the 1790s. Blake would have looked up to them as exemplars of historical and poetical art. He called them some of the most worthy and living artists, and you can see some examples of their works on the screen. And particularly the James Barry is one that we know Blake would have seen because he had his own copy of Barry's descriptive catalogue, and actually even drew portraits of Barry in his own cover, so in his own copy. So he was a big fan of James Barry and tried to emulate him as a kind of history painter. In 1809 to 10, Blake wrote that he wished to paint large-scale histories like Barry and Mortimer and display them in public spaces. He seems to have believed that painted monuments shown in civic buildings could make England like Italy, an envied storehouse of intellectual riches. So although Blake never achieved the status of a history painter like Barry or Mortimer, there is certainly evidence that he aspired to become one. For instance, between 1780 and 1805, Blake consistently submitted historical compositions to the Royal Academy. These works tended towards historical, literary, and biblical subjects. Among them, we can include works such as Blake's The Last Supper or The Miracle of the Loaves and Fishes. As you can see, these are narrative works painted in tempera, where Blake combines the graphic lines and theatrical qualities of neoclassical painting with a more historic monumentality, drawing from the visual vocabularies of Michelangelo, Raphael, Barry, and Mortimer. Yet, as we know, Blake found little success within this institutional structure and little support from patrons for his monumental historical works, which is why these kinds of tempera paintings were a particular focus for his solo exhibition and perhaps aren't as well known as his illuminated books. So by curating his own show, Blake emancipated himself from the Royal Academy's rules and restrictions of style, subject matter, and also political and social hierarchies. It is notable that several of the works that Blake chose to exhibit to the public in his exhibition of 1809 to 10 were mythological interpretations of British history. These included the spiritual form of Nelson guiding Leviathan, the spiritual form of Pitt guiding Behemoth, and the Ancient Britons, another painting which is now lost. These paintings share an ideology. They are visionary, mythological, and painted in what Blake called his ancient method of fresco painting restored. So they signified his attempt to revive what he believed were the original classical and Renaissance painting techniques, although I think they were nothing of the sort. But as you can see, in narrative scope, composition, drama, and moral power, they are certainly history-type paintings. They certainly aren't portraits or landscapes or genre scenes. However, they aren't conventional. They don't derive from classical mythology or the Bible. They are of Blake's own imaginative making. Blake's unique approach to history painting, therefore, seems to be informed by personal ideas. Moreover, his moral messages are often strange or opaque. What makes Nelson and Pitt heroic? What do the ancient Britons represent? These are Blakean archetypes, and they offer new ways of thinking about British history and politics outside the traditional mythological and religious narratives. It is alongside these temperas of the 1810s where we can categorize Blake's final Last Judgement, that is, his history of art and science. Like these, it's mythological, narrative, and didactic, but it's also got Blakean, like original Blakean characters and elements combined with kind of traditional iconographic traditions. While it is lost, we can still amass a general idea of what the design would have looked like because it essentially survives as a network of related images, anecdotes, and writings. Blake had, in fact, been working with the idea of a Last Judgement design since as early as 1805, at least 10 years before embarking on the large-scale project of the 1810s. There are at least 5, and depending on how you define what constitutes a Last Judgement by Blake, as many as 10 separate surviving drawings or tracings which precede the tempera, and these are some of them. The first of these was an illustration for Robert Blair's poem The Grave in 1805. And in this design, Blake establishes a traditional approach to the Last Judgment, which he never deviates from in his interpretations of the subject. Christ always sits in the upper third, enthroned by a heavenly host of angels, elders, and clouds. The elect souls always rise on Christ's right, and the damned souls fall on his left. The figures in Blake's Last Judgment designs are always elongated, stylized, linear, and organic. And the florid ornamental way in which they are arranged certainly invoke Gothic tracery and medieval architecture. One wonders whether Blake may have even seen remains of medieval Last Judgment wall paintings in English parish churches on his trips around Kent and Sussex in the 1780s. The tracery-like quality of Blake's Last Judgment designs also call for comparison with the drawings in Westminster Abbey, which Blake undertook while apprenticing with James Bezier in the 1770s. These early experiences with ornamental medieval art influenced Blake all his life. This is where, for instance, the idea of Blake's characteristic flaming lines comes from. Gothic style favors line, hierarchy, schematic order, and curvilinearity, and so too does Blake. Look, for instance, at the vision of the Last Judgment, which Blake made in 1806. This later drawing is twice the size of the previous one I've just shown you, and as you can see, the composition has become increasingly complex and fluid. Its foliate flow and symmetry powerfully recall Gothic architectural interiors. And also, I think this quality underlines the medievalism of his subject, because what is more Gothic than the doomsday, the final apocalypse? 3 years later, in 1808, Blake painted a further version of the Last Judgment for the Countess of Egremont, the Lady of Petworth House. And this commission was secured for Blake by his friend Ozias Humphrey. This is the most popular, most commonly written of Blake's Last Judgment designs, and this is because it is the most complete and complex surviving drawing. It is also usefully accompanied by a letter which Blake wrote to Humphrey describing the minutiae of the design for the benefit of his patron, the Countess, so she could look at it and understand what was going on. But also there's a lot of symbolic power in this particular design. It has a kind of kaleidoscopic or mandala-like quality. The movement is dynamic and cyclical, and if you squint your eyes, you might see a skull or an hourglass or even reproductive organs, which are all motifs that tie into the wider theme of the Last Judgment as a form of revelation and rebirth. So you can see why this is one that has been written about very commonly. And I've got to mention this, but there is also something in these designs that smacks of Renaissance Rome. I mean, that cyclical trajectory has the dynamism and narrative thrust which we would associate with Michelangelo's Last Judgment. And the concurrence between Blake's Last Judgments and Michelangelo's design is interesting because Blake never visited Italy. In 1783, Blake's friend John Hawkins proposed the idea of establishing an endowment fund to send him on a grand tour, but the trip never came to fruition. So instead, Blake would have studied the design of Michelangelo's Last Judgment purely in the form of printed reproductions. Well, not purely, because in 1804, 1 year before doing his first drawing of the Judgment for Robert Blair's The Grave, Blake may have seen a painted copy of Michelangelo's Last Judgment at a gallery which was in Portland Place at the time. And upon returning from that gallery and possibly seeing this large painted copy of Michelangelo's Last Judgment, Blake wrote in a letter that the experience enlightened him with the light he enjoyed in his youth. So perhaps Blake deliberately returns to the Last Judgment again and again because of its link to Michelangelo. And through Michelangelo, it's linked to a much grander and more stately Renaissance epoch of historical painting that Blake wanted to revive in British arts. And it's worth noting that there are several drawings and tracings of the Last Judgment by Blake, some of which are lost and most of which are unfinished, from this period between 1806 and 1810. And of these kind of unfinished drawings and tracings, I'm most interested in the one which is now in Washington, D.C. This is sometimes called the Rosenwald drawing. And in answer to the question of what Blake's lost painting might have looked like, I would say that this drawing is the closest proxy. I say this because the sketch most accurately fits that description of the Last Judgment which Blake wrote in his notebook, the same description in which he writes about the Last Judgment as a history of art and science. As with all of Blake's Last Judgment designs, we have Christ in the upper center, the elect on his right and the damned on his left. There are trumpeting angels sounding to the four corners of the earth and waking the dead. In the center, there is a hellmouth at the bottom of the image containing the great red dragon. His prisoners are Gog and Magog. Those are original characters by Blake. Those don't feature in the Bible. We see on Christ's left the figure of sin being dragged down by a demon holding a key. The figure of death is nailed to the cross. Satan is wound around with serpents. These are all things which Blake describes in his notebook, which is why we think this is the closest proxy to the lost painting. And then on Christ's right, we find three allegorical representations of poetry, painting, and music. They hold a lyre, a scroll, and a palette, respectively. Albion, the representative figure in Blake of kind of humanity and also kind of the ancient British. Albion is there amongst the elect with his progeny, Noah, and a kind of allegorical figure of the universal church as well. And then in the central vertical axis, just below Christ, we find Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. Just above the hellmouth, we see the harlot, the whore of Babylon. And at the very bottom, we see an animating skeleton, which is a figure that Blake also repurposed on the frontispiece for Blair's The Grave. And Blake is often repurposing the same figures because he believes that they can be used in different narrative contexts, and perhaps that also relates to his vocation as an engraver, where you would be able to repurpose kind of archetypes and images by printing them more than once. But although the Rosenwald drawing offers a useful proxy for the schema of Blake's lost painting, it doesn't give much of a sense of its style or presence. Remember, this Rosenwald drawing is uncolored and it's much smaller than the finished piece would have been. The large tempera may have had more than 1,000 figures, and this one has significantly fewer than that, more like 200. So there are a couple more paintings by Blake that I need to mention before I kind of offer a kind of idea of a reconstruction. The first of these is the largest surviving painting by Blake, an allegory of the spiritual condition of man, painted in 1811 to 13. And the second is a much later tempera painting from the 1820s entitled The Epitome of James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs. And in terms of subject matter, while neither of these are Last Judgments, they do share clear similarities in their execution and style with the Lost Tempera painting from the same period, and also with the explicit Last Judgment designs that we've been looking at. So an allegory of the spiritual condition of man was painted by Blake between 1811 and 1813. It is very large, about 3 times the size of his earlier sketches of the Last Judgment, although it is still only about 3/4 as tall as the Last Judgment apparently was. So that really would have been quite a big painting for Blake. And you can see this is the kind of direct scale comparison with the Rosenwald drawing here. So this painting really is very, very big. And this painting, in terms of what's going on narratively, it's a kind of collage of vignettes from the Bible. It begins with the creation in the upper left, and it kind of moves down and across and up again, and it finishes with the second coming in the upper right. And so what we have here is a continuous visual narrative. Running down the left-hand side, we see the creation and fall of man. On the right, we see his redemption through Jesus Christ. The figures in the center are Christ, the universal church again, and the Holy Spirit. And in terms of the vertical composition, the symmetry, the movement, and the biblical subject, this very clearly relates to the Last Judgment designs which Blake had been working on throughout the 1800s. Additionally, it's not unimportant, I think, that the final vignette in the top right is itself a Last Judgment. Remember, an allegory of the spiritual condition of man was painted sometime between 1811 and 1813, just after Blake's exhibition. And this was around the time that Blake was possibly painting the large-scale tempera of the Last Judgment. It was only 2 years later, in 1815, that George and Sidney Cumberland called in on Blake and saw that painting. Might Blake have been working on these 2 huge paintings concurrently, or one immediately after the other? Does this mean that the style of the Last Judgment painting would have been similar to this one? At the very least, this work might be comparable to the Last Judgment in scale and presence. And if you were lucky enough to see this particular painting at the 2024 Blake exhibition at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, you will know that it does have a real presence. It gives a sense of the kind of historical mural painting which Blake had wished to create in public spaces, but never really had the opportunity to do. And the final work I wish to talk about is a much later visionary illustration of the writings of the Calvinist and devotional writer James Hervey, whose work Blake might have read in the 1780s. It's a very imaginative visionary picture. This is not a kind of motif that is described by James Hervey. It's more Blake's kind of visionary response to those writings and the kinds of things they're referring to in the religious text. So there is no specific biblical event here. It's not a last judgment. There aren't official sections of elect and damned souls. However, there is a clear spiritual trajectory in the form of the staircase at the center of the image, which winds its way all the way up, conversely to kind of damnation. There is certainly Gothic style and symmetry, the flaming line. It's deeply allegorical. For instance, you see the states of wrath and mercy enshrined in the upper left and right sides of the painting, denoting good and evil. So there is a kind of good evil divide of the type that you might get in a Last Judgment. However, in a true Blakean subversion of a traditional Last Judgment format, in this painting, the fires of hell are situated at the top of the image and heaven below. The fires surround a Eurozenic, so like a vindictive, godlike figure at the top in a kind of bubble at the top in the center. And Blake inscribes this figure with the Calvinistic saying, God out of Christ is a consuming fire. Christ, who is always in the central upper third of Blake's Last Judgment, is here shown in the middle base. He is flanked by the prophets Moses and Elijah. The figure in the foreground is James Hervey himself, beset by two angels. On the sidelines, we find Old Testament figures, some of which also feature in Blake's Last Judgment designs. So we find them, and if you look closely, they're very helpfully labeled with kind of writing in the image, which is obviously typically Blake. So we have Adam, Eve, and the serpent, Cain and Abel, Enoch, Noah, the mothers of Leah and Rachel and Rebecca, Abraham with Isaac, Aaron, David, and Solomon. And so overall, I would say this design is like a combination of Blake's Last Judgment drawings and his Jacob's Ladder, if you've seen that from his biblical watercolors. The most notable feature of the coloring here, I think, is its sticky darkness, like that tempera I showed you at the beginning. It begins to evoke or give a sense of that hellish purple or as black as your hat darkness, which the witness reports of the Lost Last Judgment painting do mention. And so my research had me wondering whether if I combined the schema of the Rosenwald drawing with the scale of the allegory of the spiritual condition of man, with the colouring of the epitome of James Hervey's meditations, that I could approximate an idea of what the lost painting could have looked like. In general, I am against the use of artificial intelligence, AI, particularly for creating things from scratch. My students use it for their essays, and it is infuriating, and it kind of feels like this Eurozenic force where we give over to order instead of trusting our creativity. But I do think it has its uses, particularly for reconstruction. And so this is what I've done here. By combining the schema of the Rosenwald drawing with the colouring of Hervey's meditations and thinking about, the description of Blake's Last Judgment in his notebook. And when we have time for questions, if you'd like to discuss this more, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the use of AI for research and reconstruction, because I'm very much still on the fence myself. And, you may very much like this, or you may think it's just terrible that I've done this. So I would really like to discuss that. But, overall, I think reconstructing this picture is useful in part because of what it tells us about Blake's practice in the 1810s and 20s. It's interesting, for instance, that Blake painted his epitome of James Hervey's meditations among the tombs long after his failed exhibition of 1810, because it is thought that after that fateful exhibition, Blake all but gave up on tempera work. He withdrew into kind of private patronage, and began to focus on small watercolor commissions, such as the illustrations to Milton, Dante, and of course the Book of Job. But Blake also seems to have been working on several ambitious tempera paintings at the end of his life. This wasn't just a man who had retreated into the support of his small, dedicated circle of patrons after one failed exhibition, but instead someone who was determined to work even on a larger scale than ever before. So, let's say Blake did exhibit a Last Judgment picture at a second solo show, which never happened, but let's say he did, what if his historical pictures did gain recognition amongst a public audience? What would that mean? What would that have meant for Blake? What would that mean for how we interpret his art now? Well, I suppose Blake's projected design for The Last Judgment, like his other historical temperas, offered a new way of thinking about large-scale narrative art in the period. It kind of harked back to the Renaissance and even earlier to medieval artists, and combined Christian scripture in that design with original visionary characters, and then also brought in, ideas of ancient British mythology and culture. And that had not really been done before, or it was just beginning to be done by people like James Barrie, and taken up by Blake in a more visionary and imaginative and abstract way. And this point is significant because in 18th century terms, history painting was considered the most political form of art. It was the medium through which it was believed that an artist could fulfill his key moral and civic duties. And so I like to conceptualize Blake's Last Judgment as an imaginative yet fundamentally politically charged piece intended to revive the social and political and spiritual power which art wielded in early modern societies. The Last Judgment is a perfect subject for this because it's the motif that would have historically been found in the apses and altars of Gothic churches. It would have been it would have been the picture in the front, on the back wall that the congregation would have looked at and reflected on their kind of behavior, their morals, and their position in society and their life. And it's a subject which is closely related to the grand paintings of the Renaissance, which Blake so adored, like Michelangelo's Last Judgment. And although Blake's Last Judgment was never kind of successfully manifested as a sold painting, and it's lost to time. I mean, we might rediscover it. I mean, that would be great, but it might, in more kind of overall scholarly terms, this Last Judgment can be read as indicative of Blake's wider plan to bring art to a viewing British public. It was a goal which he considered to be one of the greatest duties to his country. And I wonder whether, if you ask Blake in his time, whether he identified as a poet or a painter of histories, I wonder what he would have said. That's the talk. Thank you, everyone. Time for questions. Stop share. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was really, really interesting. We've got a few questions coming in, and there will be hands popping up. Before we get into questions, can I just ask you to talk a little bit more about Blake's very idiosyncratic use of pigments and binding mediums? One of
Yes.
the questions that's popped up in the chat is about what we mean by fresco, because fresco in the classical sense means a grand painting painted onto plaster, and you might expect to see in the refectory, like the Last Supper, for example, which also had its technical problems. But actually, one of the reasons this painting is probably lost is because of that idiosyncratic use of mixing his own pigments and making paint, which probably wasn't really paint as it understood, with unknown qualities to it.
Yes. So you just want me to talk a bit more about
just talk a little bit more about his pigments and the really very unusual use of pigments. So he's not using, the same media that that the people he admired, Barrie and so, would have been using. He's not a classicist in that sense.
No, he's not. So the paintings which would have been, I mean, watercolor did exist in the period, but history paintings in the 18th century would have been traditionally painted in oil paints. They have greater longevity, they have greater depth of color. You can continue working on them over a long period of time. And so they were the preferred medium for artists like James Barrie or Hamilton Mortimer when he did his big histories. And those examples I showed you would have been painted in oils. So there are a number of reasons why Blake chose not to paint in oils. It really goes back to this debate in Renaissance Italian criticism that he would have read about, or maybe he would have learned about when he was studying at the Royal Academy. The idea is that in Roman and Florentine art, the design is prioritized, and so they use water-based paints like fresco, so that the design is kind of the priority and color is kind of secondary. Whereas the Venetian painters prioritize oils and they prioritize color, and design is less important to them. And for Blake, because he was vocationally trained as an engraver, he was very ideologically committed to the kind of moral supremacy of design and line over that of color. And so him choosing to paint in fresco or watercolors, he does sometimes paint in oils, but it's very unusual. Is a kind of ideological commitment to this idea of the Roman and Florentine painters, Michelangelo, Raphael, as opposed to like Titian, Tintoretto, or even the Flemish painters. He wants the design to show through his paint because he believes that the design is kind of the direct line to the imagination. And so because he's very ideologically committed to the Italian Renaissance, I suppose he reads about fresco or learns about fresco, and because it's not kind of traditionally used, he sort of creates his own version of it that he paints onto his large color paintings of the 1790s, and also his tempera paintings. I think his tempera paintings and the large color paintings are distinct in medium, but the point is that they're all water based. And that there's a kind of ideological reason for that, yes. And it all goes back to the debate between the disegno versus colore, the design versus the color. And so, yes, but I can't speak very authoritatively on what pigments, because I know you're an artist, Tamsin, so you kind of know all about specifically what types of pigments. Would he have used old white or titanium white and all of that? But he would have made it all from scratch because it was the 18th century, so I can tell you that much.
Thank you. David Fallon has got a question. David, do you want to just unmute yourself and come on screen and we can spotlight you for a moment?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes. Go ahead. What's your question?
Thank you very much for that talk. That was really interesting. I just wanted to go back to a detail. You were talking about the figures of Gog and Magog, who sort of were enrooted in my mind a bit, just because there's Julian Cope, who's a musician, very Blakey musician, has a couple of songs called Gog and Magog, and got kind of obsessed with an obscure antiquarian called T.C. Lethbridge, who wrote about the Gog and Magog hill carvings outside Cambridge. But you mentioned that they were kind of Blake's own contribution. I was just wondering, you mean in terms of that schema of the Last Judgment?
Yes, I saw it. Maybe I didn't explain that very well. A lot of the characters in Blake's Last Judgment are characters that are mentioned in the Bible. So Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Jesus Christ and the heavenly host. But then there are also characters like Gog and Magog who don't who don't objectively originate from the Last Judgment as it's described in whatever it is, the Gospel of Luke or Matthew, like Gog and Magog, for instance. And there are others, for instance, like the Church Universal. That's a kind of Blakean addition to what would have been in the source text that he's illustrating there.
Yeah, okay, that's quite good, because it does sort of suggest in a way that that's possibly blending the epitome, that kind of genre you talked about with Harvey, with the Last Judgment as well. So elements of the design might be from a slightly different genre, so he might be picking more obscure parts of the Bible.
Yes.
The Gog and Magog are interesting because they have a kind of national significance as well. They were giants that Brutus apparently fought to found Britain. And they also had statues of them in Guildhall in London, so they were quite.
I didn't know that, but
yeah. If you look at Ackerman's, I can't remember the name, the microcosm. There is actually a picture of Guildhall with the two statues there before the fire. So I think he's mixing. Yeah, it's always multi-layered, and there's kind of national.
That's really interesting, and what that tells me is that Blake is kind of syncretically combining different histories, and he's saying, well, the kind of historical figures from British history, figures from mythology, figures from the Bible, these can all exist together because they're all kind of archetypes of the same figures that we see in our imaginations. So that's really interesting. I'll look more into Gog and Magog. That's fascinating. Thank you.
It's probably my obsession.
Thank you, David. Yes, Gog Magog is, I think it's fairly typical of Blake to blend in mythological characters from the furthest corners of the British Isles, and to me that's associated with his giant Albion as well. And there's an amazing watercolor that he's got of a giant kind of fairy figure hovering over the cottage in Felpham, which is, in my mind, all associated. We have got Dion Kim. Dion, have I pronounced your name right? Would you like to come on screen?
Yeah, my name is pronounced like Dawn, like
Dawn. Okay, Dawn
between
Kim.
the night and the morning, but it spells like Daeun. But
Thank you for correcting
yeah.
me. Please go ahead with your question, Dawn.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating talk, and I'm currently a grad student who's going to write a dissertation on Blake's like last year. So this was truly wonderful and really helpful and really fun talk. I really appreciate it. So I think I have a very long comment and one simple kind of silly question, which is kind of important to me. So what I've been like the way you were tracing the influences from Michelangelo, I couldn't help myself but think of Blake's angry annotations to Joshua Reynolds' Discourses of Art, because like when Reynolds is like, you young students should not like criticize the masters of art, but like imitate them, then Blake goes on like, imitation is criticism, which means that to him, imitating and copying, it's the way of learning the language of art. And thus you have to like think critically, because you also have to maintain your own genius, which is not really valued by Reynolds. And when it comes to the history painting, which is absolutely the most, established kind of art in 18th century British, Reynolds would say something like, you should not run into particulars. And that was why I was very fascinated by the images that you have shared with us, because those history and kind of religious paintings are all about particulars. Like there is no central point that we can really focus on, and there are no background that kind of fades away. Everything is so they're all claiming for their own attention. And I thought I think Blake's exhibition of these paintings were so miserable because he was directly opposing what Reynolds have established in the Royal Academy as the right criteria of historical painting. Yeah, because like I also found this like quote that I found like relevant. He says like, unless you consult particulars, you cannot even know or see Michelangelo or Raphael or anything else. So I felt like Blake was really, I felt like maybe Blake was trying to come up with history painting that focuses on particulars, not the focalized central point and central event and the kind of like faded away background. That was my commentary, which is very long and not very important. But my real question is like, who did come to the exhibition? Because I always hear that it was a miserable exhibition, but like, do we have a visitor list?
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Dawn. What an interesting comment. I don't know a visitor list. We know that Robert Hunt attended. Critic for the Examiner, brother to Leigh Hunt, famous essayist. I'm sure that the exhibition was on for between 1809 and 1810. I'm sure Blake's friends attended, but I really can't answer that question. I don't know. I haven't looked into it.
I believe Charles Lamb saw it. Charles Lamb supposedly saw it.
Charles Lamb. So that's another essayist. There you go, Dawn.
Yeah, I like, to me,
someone says John says Crab Robinson attended. So look, he had at least 3 attendees.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I'm sure that there'll be Blake scholars in our audience and other Blake Society members who can answer that. So if you know, please drop the message into the comment box. Antonia Pesos, would you like to come and ask your question? Thank you very much.
Yes, actually, I put my question in my comments because it might be easier for people to read it, because I quote John Smith, who saw the painting apparently the last year of Blake's life. And he described it very differently from the earlier commentators. He described here what I wrote. Had Blake fortunately lived till the next year's exhibition at Somerset's House, the public would have been astonished by the exquisite finish of a fresco picture, The Last Judgment, etc., etc. Seems really different from the earlier descriptions of it. I've sometimes wondered if maybe he did it twice, and we have two lost paintings.
Yes, that's
Or,
a good point.
hmm?
Good point.
Yeah. Or else, there's more than one medium. I mean, you showed that one medium, like the Lear and Cordelia painting, which is a kind of a nasty, crusty kind of painting. Another painting like that is the Madonna and Child at Yale, has that same quality. But he also did some other paintings that were on canvas, as this one was, that were on done with a simpler medium known as distemper or glue size painting. And most famous version of that would be the Canterbury Pilgrims.
Yeah.
Another one was he did a painting of Adam and Eve, two half-length portraits. And I'm wondering if that would be the more likely medium for The Last Judgment, in which case it might be possible that it is the same painting rather than two paintings, because glue size painting is very, very opaque. So it might have allowed him to bring back that overly darkened painting. I'm just suggesting that it's a possibility.
Yes, interesting. I have read the Smith quotation, and I think I mean, that quotation was one of the ones that put me in, was something that put me in mind of, if this person saw Blake's Last Judgment and he thought actually this could have been exhibited at the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
It must have been a very high quality painting with a very impressive kind of presence. And so, you're right, it doesn't quite cohere with what the Cumberlands say about it being hellishly dark and as black as your hat and purple and all of those things. So, and I also sometimes wonder, is it possible that the witness accounts could have mixed up his paintings? I mean, I wonder if sometimes they might even be talking about an allegory of the spiritual condition of man, or James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs, and they kind of wrongly attribute them to Last Judgments because that's what they look like. But it's a very good point. Yes.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Andy Wilson, I'm trying to look through all of the comments as well. The questions are coming up in the chat as well as the hands raised. So I will try and get to everybody. So Andy, what's your question?
Hi, yeah, thanks for such a great meeting. But I did notice when you talked about the Petworth image, you said there was a gynecological aspect to it, and it caught my interest because every time I've seen it, I thought that, and I thought, it was my problem.
No, you wouldn't be the first, Andy.
I was delighted to hear that the National Trust talk about an image of who run Petworth House, describe the image of a vulva there, but because. And I do think that's definitely going on. I'm absolutely convinced about that, even in the details. But my question to you is, because you raised it, I'm not sort of you've noticed it, right? So what is this gynecological allegory image doing in a historical painting, and what does that have anything to do with Michelangelo at all? Which it doesn't. But what was going on there?
Yes, so Andy, I'm always down to talk about the vulvas in Blake's Petworth House Last Judgment. So an essay I really think of is Susan Sklar's essay on The Last Judgment in a collection of academic essays called Sexy Blake, which are kind of more, sexual interpretations of Blake's poetry and his imagery. And kind of to summarize that essay, there's a kind of organic female genitalial quality to the symmetry of that picture, and that kind of ties into a wider theme of the Last Judgment as an event of destruction, but also an event of rebirth, creation in destruction, imagination in order. Those two contrary states that Blake is always holding. So that idea of the Last Judgment being symbolic of the creation. There was recently an essay published by someone called Andrew Lukes, and actually it is the one that is in the Petworth House gift shop. And there's a whole essay about how there's a possibility that for example, in the Last Judgment, if you look closely at the elect, there are many images of mothers with children and families, and there's a lot of kind of maternal imagery. If you think about this image in a way, sort of looks like a uterus, and there's a vulva, and there's this kind of creative impulse, and there's also this kind of maternal imagery. If you look closely at the minutiae of the figures, the Countess of Egremont had many children, and she was herself a matriarch, and he was doing this commission for that countess. And Andrew Lukes argues that perhaps it's a kind of reflection of his patron and of her kind of maternal power and creative power. So that's one possible interpretation. What do vulvas have to do with history painting? I suppose everything and nothing. I suppose the thing about history painting is that it's intended to reflect these kind of archetypal stories of human life and human morality and virtue. And so I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. There are history paintings of Venus and of the birth of Venus, Leda and the Swan, sex, like anything, sex, death. These are all themes that come up in history paintings because they're themes that are in human literature and human art. Blake's approach to history painting, I hope I conveyed in my talk, Blake's approach to history painting is quite non-conventional. So his history paintings don't look like Michelangelo's, or they do look a bit like Michelangelo's, sort of in the figures do, but compositionally they're a lot more abstract, they're more two-dimensional, and that is because they have that Gothic influence. They're harkening back to a slightly earlier tradition. And think about vulvas, think about the wounds of Christ. It all comes from medieval art, really. So that's my answer there. There you go.
Andy, before we move on, before we move on, can I just point you, there was a really good Global Blake talk that might interest you, which is a Global Blake, for those of you who don't know, is the sort of academic discussion group that is international, and they host regular online talks. Annalisa Volpone did a talk on imagination and the pregnant mind in Blake's cosmology that looks a lot at this and images in his images, and you can watch it again on their website. So I think go and have a look at the Global Blake thing too, that might interest you. Thank you, Andy. That's fantastic. Stephen Eisenman, would you like to come on? So I've noted that you put a comment in the box as well. So shall I leave you to ask your question, or?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
The question, I guess, was the potential audience for this might help us understand what the picture could have looked like. The patronage of the Petworth picture, as you just discussed, was very particular. She was a very pious woman, apparently, unconventional but pious. The Last Judgment obviously wouldn't be a subject you would find in a Church of England or in anything outside of a Catholic church. What kind of a public or ecclesiastical setting could possibly have taken a picture of that size? Obviously, doing a small one, relatively small, for Petworth is one thing. It's a private commission. The other ones, I don't remember the history of the commissioning of them. But where could such a thing have been? We would need to know that to get a sense as to whether what motifs would have to be included in it and what excluded from it.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And it's unclear whether or not this Last Judgment was commissioned. Blake does write. One interesting thing he writes when he talks about his creation of fresco, and he talks about wanting to paint these public murals. He says, I could, he does this thing called portable fresco. So he paints his fresco paintings on these panels, kind of square panels, however big, that he believes could be moved around sort of Westminster Hall or Westminster Abbey at kind of at will, and ornament. So he kind of wishes to create these portable frescoes, unlike Michelangelo's and Raphael's, which are not portable, they're just like on the wall, and then put them, he says he wants to ornament the walls of Westminster with his portable frescoes, and can be removed at leisure. So it's unclear whether or not he was painting this Last Judgment for a specific space, whether or not he was painting it, as John Thomas Smith said, for resubmission to the Royal Academy, whether he was painting it for an exhibition, whether it was one of his portable frescoes that he wished to ornament Westminster and be removable at leisure. But if we did know the answer to that question, you're right, it would tell us more about what the iconography of that painting was supposed to represent, but I'm afraid I can't answer it for you. But all I can tell you is that it may have been this idea of a kind of portable mural that you can stick in any building you want, whoever's going to take it.
I just a brief follow-up. I guess the point is, what institution, assuming he made it for himself and would later on want to place it somewhere, what institution would want to have that iconography? Apart from,
Well, no, it's a very good question. So the Royal Academy, let's say the Royal Academy exhibitions. So apocalyptic.
That's not a final destination. That's just a place where you show it to the public.
Yeah, okay. So apocalyptic paintings were actually not done in the 18th century. So actually, the James Barrie mural that I cited, I gave you one panel from it, and like Odysseus speaking to the animals or speaking to the barbarians, I think. But so that is from a larger cycle of mural paintings that James Barrie painted in the Society of Arts in the kind of 1770s, 1780s, and that contains. Not a Last Judgement, but an Elysium and Tartarus, which is a kind of Last Judgement, a kind of secular Last Judgement. So that was a kind of contemporary historical mural. And so that was, I mean, that still is in the Society of Arts. If you ever go have dinner there, you can see it. They're up on the walls. And, you know, another example would be Sir Benjamin West was doing a huge mural commission in the late 18th century for the chapel at Westminster, and that would have contained a Last Judgement and a Death on the Pale Horse and apocalyptic imagery. And because Sir Benjamin West couldn't get it together, that never manifested, but it was very much in the works. And so, you know, Last Judgments were actually in demand. And if you think about, you know, John Hamilton Mortimer's Death on the Pale Horse, the late 18th century was all about apocalypse. It was the French Revolution, the American Civil War. And so although we think of the Last Judgment as a kind of medieval idea, it was very much coming back into fashion in the Gothic revival. So yes, it was happening, but Blake's obviously was very, you know, was quite medieval in style as well as in subject.
Thank you, Stephen. Let's move on. I think this is Blake's problem generally, who was going to buy it. I think it probably isn't limited to Last Judgments. Tony, come back on. But before you do, can I just say we've had lots of chat about AI in the chat. If anyone would like to ask or make a comment specifically about the AI aspect that Rebecca's raised, it'd be nice to have that discussion on here as well. So while you think about that, Anthony, I'd like to invite you back to. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I put a link in the conversation with a new book that has my essay on the Petworth painting as a vulva. So that book's available. If anybody wants me to send them the text of it, I'd be happy to send it to anybody who's interested. But what I wanted to ask is, the most troubling thing about Blake's obsession with the Last Judgment is that he did not believe in hell. So what do you think it's all about?
So I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that that Blake's Last Judgment is a traditional Last Judgment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he believes it is a kind of heaven versus hell. I think,
you know, there's that falling, and you know, they're falling.
Yes, I mean, it is. It kind of takes. It absolutely takes its structure from kind of medieval visions of hell and heaven, and the apocalypse and the Last Judgment. But really, Blake's Last Judgment is all about the struggle between the two contrary states of the human soul. It's about art and science, imagination, reason, innocence, experience, loss, Urizen, and it is for Blake. And the reason it's so cyclical and it's kind of rebirth, death, is because Blake actually believes the Last Judgment is not this like one-off event that comes at the end of the Bible, but instead this ongoing struggle that we all undertake all the time in our spirit and in our mind, this struggle between these two countries. So Blake doesn't believe in hell. The hell in his Last Judgment isn't hell. It's order, it's Urizen, it's science. So I think that's how I interpret it, at least from my reading of his notebook.
Sure.
How do you interpret it, Anthony? I'm curious to know what your view is.
I think has all. I mean, I think you have to go to his idea of states. That there, I think the Christ's left side, our right side, is definitely negative. But is it a negative that people are trapped in, or they pass through as they pass through states? So I think he's showing these various states of mind, states of being, which are not permanent things that condemn you forever, but through which one passes. I think an interesting thing that he did between the Chicago version, the early watercolor, is in that one, the seven-headed dragon and the harlot are fleeing from the edge of the painting, whereas in all the other versions they're dead center. So that cyclical quality is really reinforced in the later versions. Whereas the first version, it's more condemning because they're kind of going somewhere, but in the final versions, they're not going anywhere. They're in the circle.
Fascinating.
Thank you very much, Auntie. That's really interesting. Yeah, no, I'm thinking also about Blake's structure as well, because when I look at those images as an illustrator, I see the work of an illustrator. I don't see the similarity to the Titians that I look at in terms of, the grand, what's the word I want, a tableau. He's not creating a tableau, he's creating something with movement, which tells the story, which adds to the text, and so on. So it's quite interesting looking at it, with a design view, and looking at his, and also those paintings in the Tate, which are absolutely my favorites of Pitt and Nelson. I see the same in there. You've got your lead character absolutely center stage. It's not structured. It hasn't got the kind of chiaroscuro and structure of a grand historical painting, as the likes of Barry and Titian would have been doing. Thank you very much, Auntie. That's really interesting. I've got a question from De Villiers Neat. Have I pronounced your Neatling? I'm so sorry. Have I pronounced your name right? Would you like to come on screen and unmute yourself and do whatever? Hello.
Sure thing. Hello. Not so much a question, but I can comment on the AI side of things. I'm
Yeah,
from
go ahead,
the
please.
evil science side. So yeah, so AI is much like like to compare it to a calculator. Like if you can use a calculator to do all the maths for you, but if you don't learn how to do the maths, you'll never know if the calculator's right or wrong. And it's basically the next generation of that. It's like a calculator on steroids. So it's getting really out of control. It's getting really crazy. You can do the vibe coding and all that. So it's really difficult to discern between what's made by a human and what's made by the AI lately. But it is a very solid tool if you, just to get things done quicker and to get an idea of where you're going. And so yeah, I think it's a good idea to employ AI, but also not to get carried away with it. Not let it get ahead of you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
but in terms of question, maybe
Okay.
two questions around that. Yeah, thanks for answering the medium question. Then the one question was like Michelangelo, was Blake ever involved in social commentary? Because my understanding is that he was more of a mystic and more involved in sort of a personal mystical experience that he's trying to portray for the rest, or that he's trying to sort of bring back more like a shaman kind of sense.
Yeah.
But Michelangelo was more of a social commentary guy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that Blake certainly was a social commentator, and I also think Michelangelo had elements of spirituality in his work. I don't think those things exist separately from one another. There are, many scholars far more established than me who talk about Blake and his political, the kind of political resonance of his images. But what I can say is that in an image like The Last Judgment, Blake is taking his political views and sort of combining them with his spiritual views, and those two things for him aren't separate. So he believes that a politically enlightened state is also a spiritually enlightened one. It's one where the arts are endorsed and the arts aren't focused around kind of the arts aren't focused around kind of observing what is around us, but instead expressing what's going on in our imagination. And so kind of spiritual enlightenment and political enlightenment for Blake go hand in hand. And for Michelangelo, I think it's more complicated. He's in a completely different kind of religious and political context. But I think it's no coincidence that both of them kind of use their art in political ways, because they're great artists of their time and also tuned into what's happening contemporaneously with them. But that's a big question. But all I can say is that yes, Blake certainly did do social commentary in his art and in his writings.
Yeah, absolutely. I support that. I've just co-authored the introduction to a new edition of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is coming out from Tate Publishing later this year. And that's something that we go into, quite a lot, particularly with that particular text and its social political context. There's an awful lot going on, in Europe and internationally, really around the world at that precise moment. And he's very definitely, as Rebecca says, it's a combination of social commentary, really as not distinct from the health of the human. So absolutely, yes. Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask a question about technique and what you might have observed? Because I've long been fascinated by the paintings I mentioned earlier. The one that there's one which is, I think, pretty much permanently on display at the Tate, which is Pitt guiding Behemoth, and then it's got a companion painting which is Nelson guiding Leviathan. I'm fascinated by how he got the gold into the paint, because I've tried it many times with many different media, many different binding mediums, and I can kind of imagine how he's got that in there. There's actually gold inside mixed in with the pigment, but it seems to be in flakes rather than powdered, which would be the other way to, and it's certainly not shell gold. I just wondered if you had any insight into how he did it or could describe it any better than me, because it's an extraordinary effect. So even as the paintings have darkened because of what he's using, you've still got this extraordinary luminosity to the paintings, even in their dark state. So
Yes,
I wondered if you could,
yes.
any thoughts?
So, I mean, look, the only thing I can say about this is going back to that John Thomas Smith quotation is, I've said this to you before, Tamsin, but it may be interesting to the listeners, is that one of the things that John Thomas Smith is so struck by is the way in which Blake passes cool and warm tones over the gold pigment to create the impression of gold and silver. So he's actually painting the gold leaf and then painting blue on top of it and somehow creating silver. And so you wouldn't be the first to be blown away by Blake's kind of innovative techniques with gold leaf. But it's been a long time since I've been up close and personal with Nelson and Leviathan. But I feel like the Ghost of the Flea is quite similar, and it does have that gold flaky effect. And what it really makes me think of is, those alcohol-based gold pens? Do you know the ones I'm talking about? Like a gold pen, and it comes, you shake it and like press it down, and then the gold comes out. To me, that's what it looks like. They didn't have those in the 18th century, but I really don't. My only insight is that Smith quotation. But yes, it's a mystery. It's an enigma wrapped in a riddle.
Thank you very much. Has anyone got, thank you, David Fallon, who's just dropped out. Angus Whitehead wrote, yes, yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the difference is I'm trying to replicate it as an illustrator, and it's very frustrating when you look at somebody's artwork and you think, I'd love to know how he did that, actually, what binding is. We know that there's some interesting analysis in the Blake Quarterly that I found really from the 80s that looked at his use of very specific pigments that were, analyzed using UV light, and how the binding medium in those particular watercolors is actually carpenter's glue, which is how he can layer watercolor. Because I don't work in watercolor because I hate watercolor because it got wishy-washy. You can't get a layering of pigment in it unless you use a different binder, and he's clearly using really extraordinary stuff. Tony looks like he might be able to shed some light on it. I can see him chuckling away.
Yes.
So quickly,
if he's using glue size paint, which is I think he's doing, glue size paint is actually carpenter's glue. Carpenter's glue, it's when they take horses to the glue factory, that's the glue.
It has to be hot, doesn't it?
It's basically collagen made in suspension, and that is what Renaissance painters would use to adhere gold leaf to their surfaces. So if he was using glue size paint, he could simply activate it with even by breathing on it. Just the vapor from his breath would activate the glue size enough to adhere the gold to it.
Thank you. Yeah, gold leaf. I work with gold leaf, and it is very difficult because you breathe a bit heavily and it flutters across the room.
That's true too. Yeah,
it's hard to work with. It really is hard to work with. Thank you very much for that small insight. Has anyone got any final questions for us before I wrap things up? Just to mention a connection in the Westminster Abbey drawings, members might like to know that Mark Crosby's article, The Gothic Artist William Blake's Apprentice Drawings and Copper Plates in the Bodleian Library, has now been published in the Bodleian Library record. So please do look that up. Thank you, Alan. Mark's also got a new book out as well, so go on with that.
Yes, here's a question about AI.
Yeah, go for it.
So I use ChatGPT, and I put in a copy of the Rosenwald drawing and James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs, and I said, could you please take the design of the Rosenwald drawing and color it like this drawing, James Hervey's Meditations Among the Tombs, and that is what it spat out. How do I feel about it? I feel okay because I've admitted that I've done it. I think if I did it in secret and claimed it was my own design, I would feel deeply guilty. But I think the fact is that AI is out there and people do use it. And, actually, I've spoken to my friends who are classic scholars, and they say they're using it to reconstruct fragmented classical texts and stones. And, I think for reconstruction purposes, I think it is useful. I'm pro the ethical use of AI is how I feel about it, is what I think. And I think it's always, always cite your sources. So there you go, it was ChatGPT.
Rebecca, thank you very, very much. I'm going to wrap up there.